All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're really excited that you're able to join us and excited to start this USACE Sustainability Project Delivery Series. So this is our first one, starting with Integrative Design. It will be running about weekly as you see those invites coming out. Of course, we have holidays and things to consider, so maybe not strictly weekly, but pretty close to that. And really, this whole series will be conducted by multiple people through many districts or division locations. Many of those are people who have been a part of our course, our Sustainability, Military Building Design, and Construction class. And as we go through today, please make sure you have your phone muted. And if you have any questions, as Andy has indicated in the chat there, go ahead and write those in there, and I'll do my best to track them down and help Andy to answer those. And then if there's anything else that we need follow up, please let us know, or feedback. We're always welcoming feedback. And so really, as I said, I'm Nicole Burman, and my main job is to help MC this effort today and Andy out. I work for the Kansas City District, and I will then introduce Andy. So our speaker today is Andy T Meyer, and he is a registered architect and a program project manager for USACE in the Omaha district, and he has been with Omaha for 12 years. Andy has extensive experience in sustainable design and development of all phases of project delivery, and has been on the teaching cadre for the Prospect Course 244 since 2015. And so he graduated from Iowa State University with a professional degree in architecture, and also has his LEED AP BD+C. He was born, raised, and currently resides in Council Bluff, Iowa, and is serving as the Army Corps of Engineers program manager for the B-21 bed down at Ellsworth Air Force Base. So I'll let you take it away, Andy.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everybody. As we kick this series off, I guess I'm going to attempt to a caveat that we're trying to figure out what specifically what sort of audience that we're reaching, and at what level we really need to speak to some of these topics. I certainly can promise that we will more than likely not be able to answer all of your questions, but I think we have a group of people that are facilitating this webinar series that are more than happy to try to bird dog things, and whether it's integrated design related, or whether it's on broader topics of sustainability. We definitely have a passion for pursuing these things. So hopefully this is a start of a broader conversation, and we'll keep that conversation going here. Please don't hesitate to provide feedback in the chat box as well. We want to make this fruitful use of everybody's time. So today the plan is to talk about integrated design, and certainly as we go through some of these slides, we will be diving in on some of these topics through in other weeks. Most of this is a survey level type discussion, and again, we'll dive in further. So with this presentation, we're hoping to mostly describe the general concepts of the integrated design process. If you're working on Army projects, one of the constant things that we maybe talk about in the prospect course or day-to-day is maybe some of the inherent tension between what the UFC may require or what the IGCC may require for compliance versus LEED for compliance with, for example, the integrated design credit. I don't know that we're going to dive too much into that today, but I think we're definitely aware that some of those requirements may not fully align, and we can work through some of that. Our main resources for our discussion today that I would definitely recommend you guys dive in on would be, first and foremost, UFC 1-200-02. That UFC is kind of the Bible for everything that we do for military design and construction when it relates to high-performance sustainable buildings. So when we first started working on these prospect courses, the UFC didn't exist, and so there was a huge amount of focus on how to reconcile what, for example, Army's guidance on sustainability was versus what LEED was requiring for compliance. And I feel, I think most of us feel pretty strongly that UFC has gone a long way in unifying our requirements and bring them under the umbrella of the DoD building code. So second is the International Green Construction Code. That is formerly known as ASHRAE 189.1. They went through a name change, I don't remember when, a couple of years ago. The basic format of that standard is the same, but you should be, if you work for the Corps of Engineers, you should be able to access that through IHS, and you can get to that link through the whole building design guide. LEED Online is definitely a resource. If you haven't been on LEED online recently, well, not even recently, but if you've never been on LEED Online, there's an immense amount of resources regarding not only how to comply with specific credits, but also with, supporting documentation, guidance, videos, things like that. There's a LEED credit library. I think for purposes of this presentation, we're mostly looking to bring your attention to that integrative process credit under version 4.1, and I believe you could also pursue it as a pilot credit under 2009. Whole building design guide is always a good resource for integrated design. We have a link here that takes you to a web page under that website, and then also two maybe less directly related to the work that we do, but as far as integrated design, the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice does a good job of conveying what the goals of integrated design process may be. And then there's this Better Bricks. There's a really good video on that website that very short, kind of gives some different perspectives on what integrated design process is. So more of the same. So integrated design theory from the Whole Building Design Guide. Ultimately, the whole idea here is that we are engaged in a process when we deliver projects that is holistic in nature and involves all stakeholders and all I don't even want to caveat it as critical parties, all parties that may have an interest in either designing, occupying, or maintaining that building and constructing the building throughout the project life cycle. All right. And so ultimately, the reason that those parties are involved is so that goals are identified early on and that they're held in proper balance or in proper tension. So, ultimately, as I'm not sure if we have a preponderance of construction personnel or design and engineering side or project managers online today, but ultimately, there's always kind of this natural progress through a project life cycle where different entities, maybe have a little bit more control or sway on the process. And ultimately, when you talk about integrated design, the desire is hold those priorities in balance as much as we possibly can. So, you know, there's a multitude of different design objectives that we can track as part of the integrated design process. These are just a few of many. Ultimately, we're looking to assure that that all of these, you know, fall somewhere on the priority list and are held in balance. And then, you know, a lot of times, you know, things like budget and scope, and those are all recurring topics. Those things, it doesn't mean that all of those priorities just play second fiddle to things like the sustainability or renewables or resilience. But again, if you can leverage this process on a more holistic manner and get involved early on in project delivery, your ability to deliver that later on in the project lifecycle is obviously higher. Nicole, is there anything you think I should chime in or that you'd like to add in on any of that?
No, not right now. I think we dive into a bit more detail in a minute.
Okay. So here is, many of you may have seen a chart like this before, but this is a conceptual idea of how we deliver projects. And under a traditional design process, there's a bit of a rub. You can see that in line number 3. So, you know, ultimately, as you initiate a project, starting in early planning, schematic design, design development, so you're going through an entire project lifecycle. The amount of effort or amount of effect that you may have on a project for a proportionate cost, it decreases. So if you're really early in the design process, you can make very large-scale changes to a project and have a less dramatic impact on that project cost, mostly because you can still budget accordingly for those features or scope or whatever the case may be. The corresponding cost of a change to a project increases exponentially as the project matures. So many of you have probably seen this swooping X sort of diagram before. This chart also shows where in a traditional design process, shown by 3 here, a lot of times the bulk of those decisions are being made at a point where you're having not an ideal impact on your project scope and budget proportional to your delivery timeline. Integrated design assures that the correct people are in the room and making appropriate decisions much earlier in design or in the project delivery. So you see this little hump that was in project 3 more pushed further to the right in the timeline is now pushed further to the left, and it fits under what maybe you would see that cost curve. And so ultimately what this means is, yes, you know, when we teach this prospect course, there's a lot of questions like, this means there's more effort. And absolutely, that's the case. There's more effort early on in the project. You get all the right people in the room with the hope that then by the time the project hits the later stages of design development and execution, that you've resolved most of those issues and you curb risks for extended design or redesign and things like that. So to reiterate, you know, hundreds of years ago, some of the first architects, the whole basic process for integrated design wasn't, maybe it was a little more similar to what we would hope it to be today, but architects were more closely closely integrated with the people that actually were constructing the facilities. So as design and technology and demands on projects have evolved, the whole process for how we deliver facilities has also evolved. In the 20th century, there was a bit of a sentiment that you would compartmentalize work. So architects would develop a concept design or schematic design, and then the expectation is that you bring in a subset of other consultants or engineers, or however you want to say that, to design within the constraints of let's call it the envelope or the box that the architect develops in a floor plan or elevations and things like that. There was minimal opportunity for an engineer to provide input to those architects' decisions before they saw, a fully developed floor plan or something like that. Same thing with mechanical and electrical engineering. It was more of a I'll do my job, throw that design over the cubicle wall, and let the next person pick up on it, and that with the expectation that they fit that building subsystem within those constraints. To be honest, there's some benefits and drawbacks associated with that. Facilities design during that time maybe were a little bit more robust, or they were more genericized in their ability to accommodate a differing subset of systems, because ultimately architects were trained to make assumptions and usually conservative assumptions about how to accommodate those things so that they didn't create a need for rework on the back end. And so when you're talking about high performance sustainable buildings and a desire to improve the performance of those buildings, you can't always afford that sort of conservative approach. So I like to think about a high performance sustainable building by comparing it to like a race car. You're not going to optimize the performance of that race car if you just make the most conservative assumptions about every little component of that machine that you hope performs at a high level. Same thing with a building. So in high performance sustainable and integrated design, the desire is that we all get together early on in the design process, use a multidisciplinary team of designers, consultants, builders, stakeholders, whoever it may be, to define project goals holistically, and then commit to delivering within those bounds. Changes do happen, but you at least are establishing a more holistic subset of goals, and then tracking those through the project evolution. That also means that people that often were involved early in the design lifecycle, but then forget about the project or are cut out of the process early on, also remain engaged in that process much later. Maybe they're not involved, if the project's in construction, maybe they're not, and they're normally involved in planning, maybe they're not as engaged as your construction staff, but they have a beat on the project, and they're understanding, and they're helping to validate that planning level goals are still being implemented and being tracked to resolution. So sometimes I don't know what everyone's perspective is, but in speaking from the experience I've had, serving as a architect and design team lead over the last 10-ish years, it can be frustrating when you take on a project. The 1391's already been established or locked, whatever term you want to use, and ultimately you're given a set of constraints, a scope limit, a budget, and then you're asked to implement all of this stuff on the project, and it just doesn't all seem to balance out. That happens, and we still have to deliver on those projects. With all that being said, more often than not, there are opportunities for the Corps of Engineers to be involved in programming and planning projects. And I don't, maybe that isn't directly involved with developing a 1391, but I guess maybe that's a bit of a challenge or a charge, is figure out how we can be offer our competencies and our skill sets more to that process. I do certainly think that situation has improved over since the establishment of the UFC 1200-02, but that doesn't also mean that there's room for improvement. But at the programming and planning level, some of the main priorities with respect to integrated design is to ensure that you have proper budget and scope, that you've analyzed your site on a broader basis, that you've made accommodations for climate and local weather conditions, landscape, the site-specific landscape features, things like that, and then also set reasonable and targetable energy, water, and material goals that you can continue to track through the duration of the project. I did want to. This isn't something that's necessarily in our slide deck too terribly well, but many of you may have heard about the new OSD policy for 35% design requirements. And this is something that now as a project manager, I see a little bit more directly, but I certainly do think that this has improved, and it dovetails really well with the integrated design process. Previously, a 35% design, you get to a 35% design, your 1391, your scope and cost parameters have been locked for quite some time. Under this new OSD policy, if you complete the project and you develop the project to the required level of development, and you substantiate the project cost and budget, you provide all your LCCAs and things like that, it does allow the stakeholder to increase their project scope or budget at that 35% design level. And I can't speak to that for every project. I'm not going to sit here and act like that's something that's going to happen on every single project, but I guess the bottom line is it has created a window or an opening for projects to go another step in developing their sustainability goals in an integrated manner. And as long as you provide all that documentation to back it up, it doesn't close the door on revising your programming parameters. So that OSD, I see a question in the chat box here. It's known as the Lord memo, and I think we can share it. I mean, it certainly made its rounds. Eric, are you tracking that? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Let's see. I think I can look into it. I think there is something. Okay. I'll get who knows something about it.
I have it. I just don't know if sharing the memo is the best way to do it, or if headquarters has interim guidance that we should be sharing. But I tell you what, we can collect that offline and probably just distribute it to the team.
Yeah, and I can check with Jeff Hooghouse, our VE person, and see if he's tracking it, if they're going to put an ECB out or something in the works.
Yeah.
Well, so I think there's two comments here. There's the memo, which is a great statement, Andy. I think that has changed over time, and even a part of sustainability reviews with the ASA. They've even mentioned that several times too as a really good tool to utilize. And then you make a good point here about the value engineering on the other slide when we're talking about that upfront work and how much value that brings. Really, a lot of the work that we already do or already is in place helps and is supposed to be there to demonstrate integrative design, and VE is a great example of that, is really being able to not only meet your VE thresholds that are told to us, but also in a way that allows us to do that integrative design work and bring up good ideas to analyze maybe in a VE study to be able to take a little bit of load off of a team or analyzed from that VE study, depending on the timing your project approaches VE. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I think the VE comment's really valid. I think we're still trying to. I'll speak for myself. I'm still trying to figure out specifically how all of this OSD reporting dovetails with the VE process, or maybe if we could make that even more leverageable. Because a lot of time, well, in my experience, we've been trying to run that VE process concurrent with the design certification and design construction agent certification that's required to come out of that memo. And I do wonder if we were to maybe front load the VE a little bit. But it's all been this has all been implemented in a phased manner that I think a lot of us are trying to figure out that requirement as we complete our projects on their traditional timeline. And so over time, I think maybe we'll be able to improve upon that. But.
Yeah, and this frankly has moved up over the few years to where it has to be around 35%. So I think every project has an opportunity to have it before if you to distribute something and make that scope of work work for your team, or right after 35% for that high impact to that development of that project. Over.
Sure. I'm going to transition a little bit into schematic design, and I'll caveat it. I believe we're going to be having distinct webinars on the individual design phases coming up here. So probably not going to dive too terribly deep into these, but keep an eye out for those. I don't know if it'll be. I can't remember, Eric, if we have one for each, or I thought we maybe combined a couple of these as well, but we'll have more discussion on these individual design phases. Ultimately, schematic design phase, you're trying to take those overarching goals that you established as reasonable and achievable in programming and build them into something that you think you can relate, based off of technical and engineering expertise, into something that you can implement at the project scale. You can start, I know if there's any mechanical engineers, when we teach the prospect course, if there's any mechanical engineers online, we teach the prospect course, we talk about how important it is to start energy modeling early. And you can do energy modeling at the planning level. You can do energy modeling during schematic design, and you can do it all the way throughout the project lifecycle. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a train model built out the same way when you're writing up your 1391 as you are when you're finishing up your construction documents and trying to, finish up a compliance model that shows you're saving the amount of energy that you had targeted. But you can use those tools to continue to validate during the integrated design process, so that when you show up to do your construction documents, you're not just totally surprised that you're off track. You can start analyzing daylighting effects, whether that's on how the building relates to the site or internal to the building. Perhaps that analysis isn't super granular, but it can start to inform how you arrange spaces and organize your building floor plan or things like that. We teach in the prospect course that usually at this time you can actually finish your water use credit, at least on the design side, and that always strikes people strangely. And until I didn't even necessarily believe it until I attempted to do it a couple of times. And you can have a pretty good idea in order to comply with the LEED credits. You can have a pretty good idea what your calculated water savings is going to be. Like by the time you have a fixture count in your facility, you probably have a general idea of what sort of flow rates you can get industry-wide on a lot of your fixtures. And as long as you have an idea of what general uses are present in the building and how many fixtures you're going to have, a lot of times, again, I'll throw myself under the bus. We'd be working that credit while we're advertising, trying to catch up to all the documentation we need. You can use some of those calculators and tools that third-party certifiers like LEED have to offer, and you can include it in your design analysis. During design development, this phase is all about refining what you've built on during schematic design, this is where I'd argue things like BIM really come into play and really earn the effort that you use, that you invest into developing those models. It allows you and the project delivery team or the design team to really integrate requirements rather than just kind of slap them on top of one another. So I don't know if it's very easy to see, but the background of this slide, we were building out different, this was a study that we were doing on building out different, I think, facade schemes for a project and trying to illustrate how you could do some ventilation integral to the curtain wall assembly, I believe. But ultimately, build upon schematic design. Resist the urge to go straight into construction documentation and refine and optimize the performance of your project while your time and cost curves haven't caught up to one another, and you're creating a bunch of potential cost and rework for yourself if you make these changes later. So during construction documentation, again, maybe the statement or the focus is resist the urge to move from schematic design to construction documentation. Acknowledge that there's time for your project delivery team to study the facility and produce a design that is as optimized as it possibly can. I'm fully aware that a lot of times our design deliverable requirements don't, and our project schedules often don't allow what seems like the time to do this, and I think perhaps some of this is more of a design communication problem than anything. If you spend the time to develop conceptual models or model building subsystems in a manner that falls outside the realm of a set of drawings and specs, you may find someone that says, well, you're not progressing on your design. Well, that's just not true. It may not be represented in the manner that maybe under the previous design processes, under non-integrated design processes, looks like the progress that you would previously assume, but spending the time to work in a conceptual energy model or an iterative energy model or some sort of other systems level analysis, that tends to be time well spent in delivering a high performance and sustainable building. So ultimately, construction documentation is important, but the overarching end goal in an integrated design process is you're literally doing that. If you find yourself drawing details and trying to figure out how to integrate sustainable features into them while you're doing construction documentation, it's probably evidence that you put the cart before the horse a little bit, and you should have maybe stuck with design development a little bit longer to fully resolve how some of those details would work. And this documentation process is literally that, just putting it on paper. And I know that sounds very oversimplistic, and it is to a certain extent, but that should be the goal ultimately, and then you can live in the reality from there on out. But as far as design documentation goes, a lot of times it's lost. The communication flow is lost between between the completion of the design and the engineering side versus picking up on that project in construction. So we try to bring some focus on completing your engineering considerations and instructions to field personnel so that they understand not only what's written in the drawings and specs, but they understand the backstory as to why some of that stuff is there. I see
we
some
have a
comments
couple questions
popping
here.
up. Yeah.
I think Billy, your statement about not aligning, I guess I have not found that to be true. The design development and the schematic, I think in AIA, even in our ERs, or maybe it's an AR, that speak to that the planning is the 1391 or the PD. I think that really ultimately, as we go through these, we find that if we explain our process, how our mission works, even if LEED sees it slightly different, you can justify it as long as you explain your work, just like a math equation, right? Show your work and how to do that. So I don't know if there's a high risk of not complying with that, but the point that we mentioned before with the early modeling is really valuable to do early, and I've seen on projects where it's been successful, and then others that later, right, you get down to the construction documents that stated, and you realize maybe we should have spent a little bit more time looking at that because we're not getting the results we were hoping for. And that model doesn't have to be, that detailed one. It could be something you can spit out, use a Revit model or whatnot. There's other tools that districts can find or have found to be able to input that. And so for the RFP element, really that's written in the RFP, and so they're ultimately required or should be written in there to require them to follow these requirements and meet that third party, and then as QA, we're holding them to those requirements, looking for the energy model coming out of the charrette or identifying when it's going to be coming and seeing that in that DA at 35%.
This is Andy. I can certainly speak to that. That's been a topic in Omaha District for some time, and it's a bit of a hurdle to get over, to think that maybe we need to do some energy modeling or do an LCCA before we issue a design build RFP. And I know that can sound a little bit uncomfortable, especially in resource and personnel constrained environments. But the bottom line is unless there's some backing to those expectations in the RFP, you're often, if you don't do that, you can put those requirements for an LCCA on a contractor, but you've undercut your ability to do that typically within the bounds of our traditional contracting processes. There's all kinds of examples where you can do that differently, but I think over time the general consensus is it's best to do that stuff earlier, and that gives you the most, for lack of a better word, integrated solutions. Moving on into, so I just see a comment here. It's been my experience that installations aren't doing energy modeling or LCCA. I think that's probably a very fair assessment. And I guess, these are complex and realities and things like that, but perhaps those are things that we as the Corps can offer our help on. Those are probably things that those are conversations that have to happen over time and provide some means to convey value to the overarching process. But if you want to justify a geothermal system on a facility, you're going to be better off providing some life cycle analysis early on so that you can substantiate that cost, because the reality is oftentimes that those do come at a higher cost to the project, and try to avoid that self-perpetuating cycle of, oh, we want this, but we can't afford it, so therefore, we're going to pass on it now and things like that. During construction, at the construction kickoff meeting, there definitely should be focus on the project sustainability goals. You know, in addition to your standard, your construction side plans for demolition, your SWIP and stuff like that, also add in a sustainability plan, which should be required in pretty much any edit of that 013329. I can't remember the name now, Sustainability Reporting Specification, UFGS. I would absolutely, and again, Army is still tracking lead specific goals, but other services are tracking other third-party certification requirements. Either way, require that the contractor employ a lead AP or other relevant credential professional. Some of these other third-party certification systems, you know, if there is no other equivalent certification for the system you're pursuing, I'd still argue that it's probably beneficial to have a lead AP on that project team. They're going to have a better understanding of the basics of sustainability and should be able to pivot that into whatever system you're trying to get certified under. So in preparing or during occupancy, we want to make sure that we're commissioning all of our building systems. So there's the total building commissioning spec that we should be including in our projects, flush out the building prior to occupancy, and avoid or purge the project of all those, you know, VOCs and other contaminants in the air and things like that before you turn over the building, and assure that you're turning over a facility that's the best that it can be for from a sustainability perspective for the occupants that then are going to pick up on all of these goals you've established during design and construction, planning, design, and construction, and they have an understanding of how to occupy that building into the future. And that's where last bullet here is give them the manuals and all the documentation they need, as well as the training, so that when you can't just ask, you know, some random person on the street to tune a race car. If we're designing buildings as high performance machines, there is a reality that sometimes these require a little bit more focus on the O&M side, and we as designers and construction agents should keep that in mind, but ultimately, you know, we have to acknowledge that somebody's going to have to pick up on all of this stuff and have the ability to maintain it. Post-occupancy, do you know, follow through on your construction contract requirements. Do your 6 and 9 month post-construction walkthroughs. Recommission your building systems, which Nicole and I were talking. I'm not sure that we have a huge track record of seeing that being completed at the installation level, but ultimately that should be part of the discussion, and perhaps that's something that we can further emphasize when we're earlier in the process. And then I think that it's really, really important to acknowledge that on a given project, you're gonna be successful on things, and you're gonna maybe not be successful on things, and it's okay to acknowledge that and learn from it, and ultimately, whatever this means, document it so that as a team we can learn from those things in the future. Maybe it's just something didn't work out quite the way you want. It still works fine, but it didn't. You know, or it was a disproportionate amount of effort for the benefit that you gained. Maybe you have a way to build on those lessons learned, so that next time it's either less effort or you get more benefit from it. You know, increase that cost-benefit analysis. We definitely. I would, you know, ultimately, I don't know if I can say unilaterally you have to use an integrated design process to deliver a high-performance building, but it's definitely going to make this whole process easier. If you fall back on the approach where you're going to make a bunch of design decisions, kick it over to the next engineer, and they're going to fit within those bounds. You ultimately end up with a solution that will, not discounting that it'll work, but I think you're probably going to struggle to hit a lot of the goals and targets that the UFC and DoD are demanding and the federal government are demanding out of their facilities today. This is just reinforcing, use a collaborative approach and identify those goals early and comprehensively. As far as the integrative process credit goes, I'm not really that qualified to do a deep dive on this, but as kind of Nicole said, I do think LEED understands nuance, and so there's a lot of importance. I would emphasize, if you have an alternate compliance method on something, or you were cut out of a process, and as a project delivery team, you don't have the ability to do something, but then from there on out, you did the right thing and you attempted to achieve the credit. I would argue I've been fairly successful in conveying that those types of situations to LEED, and it's not always successful, but more often than not, it seems like LEED is there. Ultimately, it doesn't improve their bottom line to not certify a building. They do want to maintain standards, but if they can stand behind your logic and what you put on paper and your compliance path, I think a lot of times their ears will be open.
Yeah, especially in the integrated design credit, we won't go into much detail because we're running out of time, but it is, it's focusing from what we used to have in 2009 and before on just, water and energy into a holistic integrative of this full building and site. Everything is kind of being considered, and you have to demonstrate how you consider that as a team integrated together, and noting what your constraints are, which we have several, especially when it comes to security and different elements that come up in our projects. Still helps tell that story, and if you can tell that story to them who don't know everything, then they're able to understand why something wasn't able to be accomplished. Absolutely.
So we're going to run through a couple of project examples. I'm not going to breeze through these fairly quickly, but this was one of my first projects. This was certified under a much older LEED system. I think it was version 2.2, but ultimately it was a project that was able to succeed by establishing goals early. You can see it has PV on the roof. That's a benefit of, to be blunt, a good pricing environment, but also a group of stakeholders voicing a preference for that type of stuff early. So you do kind of have to have all of those factors align. But the one thing that I would say is that ultimately you're not going to be able to build on those requirements if you don't establish them early and track them down. We had in this case, I think it was a bid option there to be able to pull the trigger on and install it, and ultimately we were able to take advantage of the good pricing environment. Ultimately, the other thing that I like to talk about this one is it's a cost. It's a run-of-the-mill project, and then ultimately we were able to deliver a LEED Platinum facility designed in-house in Omaha, and it's kind of nothing special. And I think it's just in my mind, it's kept me motivated over the years that we can achieve these goals. Not every project's going to turn out a LEED Platinum certification, but it's just a good example of a delivery team that kind of took these goals under their wing very early on and then followed through on them. I don't know how many people we have sitting in Seattle District today, but we often teach this prospect course, which we haven't taught in a couple of years, in Seattle. Their new district headquarters is an amazing building, has a really unique procurement strategy that is worth worth learning a little bit about. But ultimately, it was procured by GSA, and I believe it was what we'd call a pay-for-performance contract. So they did some sort of design-build RFP, GSA did, where they established an energy usage intensity goal for the building, received proposals on that, ended up awarding to this design-build firm, and then on the back end, they withheld a certain amount of their fee and measured the building performance for a year during occupancy. And, ultimately, halfway through the year, I believe that the facility wasn't meeting its goals, energy performance-wise. The design-build contractor came in with their designer of record and made some corrections, and ultimately they were able to deliver within parameters and claim the rest of their fee. So it's a really unique type of project. I think a lot of that wood is reclaimed wood. If you ever have the opportunity, it's definitely a cool building to tour, and it's something that people in Seattle get to experience every day. So. Nicole, did you want to speak to any of these, or should we wrap things up?
I guess I wouldn't mind touching on points. Let me scan through here. If you want to go back to the NREL one, so this is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Just something to point out here, the integrative process also brings, like Andy mentioned before, those lessons learned, pulling together, and really that actually came from this building is, a different federal facility, but yet it came from a lot of lessons learned that the same AE firm provided in a Fort Carson battalion or brigade combat team brigade battalion headquarters combo buildings. And so that building was actually the first lead project for USACE in the AE from an AE firm, and then they pulled over that information and did additional work because obviously this is a energy laboratory, so made a net zero, very highly sustainable building out of that. There's plenty of other notes from that, but due to time, let's go ahead and move on. The next two, so first we've got the Prime Power Project. And so here, this was the first LEED Gold project by an in-house team, and it really integrated all the pieces. So both this one and the next project will integrate team members from the design team, construction, and the next one was, so that's okay, and really doing that early contractor involvement, so CI, and so that brought in both the contractor even into the Kansas City district office a couple times a week, helped work through those problem-solving parts. And then, like we mentioned before, a lot of this really comes from the fact that team members spent a lot of time, depending on which schedule we're talking about, but on this project particularly, a lot of time working on that design, that development of that design before they even moved to construction documents. So they had 3D models, this was before Revit, that they worked on and worked through, did their analysis, and then they were able to even carry that information through construction. So when construction items came up, when we're looking at the large crane that was in here, designed tight ductwork to make work in this building, but we knew it could work, worked all of that together with all the players all the way through construction. So it was a really successful project because we had that integrative design from start to finish. And then I think that was all you had for me. Yep.
Yep. So ultimately, when it comes to a culture of integrated design, we've got to understand this process at multiple levels. And so, we need to focus on open lines of communication and understanding that sometimes the best interests of the project may not be the most, expedient thing at at the given moment for whatever you're doing in that process. Ultimately, we should be thinking about the entire project delivery life cycle rather than the individual needs at the moment. And I think it's important to understand that can occur at multiple scales in project delivery. So you talk about local integration, making sure that your stakeholders are involved in this process, that they have a grasp on not only the need to do this and that they understand that this isn't just willy-nilly pie-in-the-sky wishes. These are things that we need to deliver on in order to comply with the UFC, and that they are working their end of the bargain in programming and then also operating these facilities correctly. On a regional scale, Nicole and I happen to sit in the best division in the Corps of Engineers and for sustainability. And so ultimately, I think one thing that our division does do a fairly good job at, but we also struggle with at times, is leveraging our regional resources in sharing lessons learned and expertise. And then at the national level, there's all kinds of resources. The Corps of Engineers is a huge organization. We can leverage expertise across the nation and the world to deliver on unique requirements and seek out the help of people that, for what we think may be unique, is run of the mill for them, given where they are and what they're delivering on a fairly consistent basis. So ultimately, the last thing, I see some stuff in the chat box. One thing that I think both Nicole and I agree on is LEED and the UFC requirements don't always fully align. We talked about that earlier. That can't be used as an excuse for throwing our hands up in the air and say, well, because I can't meet this LEED credit, I'm not going to comply with the rest of the UFC. A lot of this is about pushing the project as far along as you can and documenting it as such. And just because you can't meet, one goal doesn't mean we should abandon all sustainability goals. And as that relates to third-party certification, the requirements for LEED are not getting any easier. They're getting much more difficult. And but there's a whole subset of criteria that are fairly straightforward and easier to comply with if you get involved at the right stages contained within the UFC. The third-party certification is a component of the UFC requirements. It is not part and parcel of the UFC requirements. Did I capture that correctly, Nicole?
Yes, I believe so. We do have one question in the question and answer one asking about what's the current USACE partnering stance. I don't know how, if somebody could talk on that, at least for me, unless you have an answer to that, Andy. What about here?
I don't know what context that question's being asked. Ultimately, I know in our contracts we tell the contractors that they have to assume partnering on a twice-a-year basis, and sustainability would be a part of that. I'm not saying that that's the focus of the meeting every time, but it probably should be on the agenda. I don't know if that answers the question. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I do want to respect everybody's time. As far as additional learning goes, ultimately, there's a bunch of additional prospect courses. The one that we're dovetailing with right now is Prospect 244. We do a much broader deep dive on this. There's all kinds of other third-party resources, LEED training, Green Building Institute, things like that. Definitely lots of opportunities to learn out there. So I think that wraps things up.
Yeah, and we do appreciate you guys joining in today. If you have any additional questions or feedback, like we mentioned, please send them our way, or or just thoughts on how learning this would work in other ways. So it's always welcomed. We're going to be gathering that as a team and go from there. Thank you all for joining us today.
Next week, there is no session, but we will have the next session will be the following the week after that. If you want the presentation, see if it came in your inbox and an update to the meeting announcement. And if it didn't, shoot me an email. This is Eric Mucklow, M-U-C-K-L-O-W. I'm the only Mucklow in the global, and I'll send it to you. Otherwise, I will be soon editing that weekly invite for the next session. And so it will disappear if you don't get that PDF out of there soon. Thank you for all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.